Our next presenter will be Patrick Donnelly. Patrick is a landscape ecologist with the Intermountain West Joint Venture. Sorry, don't have my glasses on. He's a landscape ecologist with the Intermountain West Joint Venture. He conducts research from the University of Montana as a faculty affiliate in the wildlife program. Patrick?
Thank you, Christian and folks for showing up. When I step into this talk, I like to remind people of is conservation is much more often the result of opportunity than systematic planning. And with chaos often follows funding and cash, and we like to build our conservation strategies around that kind of genre. And sage grouse might follow that kind of an example. In the last 5 years, we've seen a large increase in conservation actions across the West. And we tie that back to single species. We heard Rick and others earlier in the presentation talk about how we want to begin to pivot from that single species conservation to a multi-species approach. And so the work I'm going to present today talks about some of those first steps and looking at cross benefits we're seeing in those conservation effects for grouse. And we're going to link it back to songbirds, sagebrush obligate songbirds across the West. So 3 different species we looked at: brewer's sparrow, sagebrush sparrow, and sage thrasher. And when we looked at these birds, we wanted to ensure that we can actually look at those birds and their kind of cross habitat benefits relative to sage grouse restorations at very broad scales. So we want to look at big data. And we look at big data, there's really only one data set we have available to us to utilize, and that's BBS, so breeding bird survey information. Those of you who aren't familiar with BBS, it's a spring breeding bird survey, occurs across the West, and you can see these points on the map, which are actually transects that are driven by volunteers in the spring. They're about 25 miles long, 40 kilometers. Every half mile, those observers stop, get out. They spend 3 minutes listening to audible calls or visual sightings of different species. They record those, and they move on to the next site. So this very large data set presented a way for us to begin to model the extent of these birds in ways we haven't had those models previous, because we wanted to compare these distributions and co-occurrences of these birds back to sage grouse to align our conservation strategies across these big areas. And so to inform these models, what we did was we took these routes occupied by the bird numbers, which are enumerated along the red lines, and we buffered them by a distance 200 meters, which was our distance we could actually detect audibly or sight those birds along those transects. And we collected all this information you can see using remote sensing inside those buffers, and we dropped everything into a big machine learning algorithm. And we began to spit out these responses these birds were tied to across the entire West. And lo and behold, when looking at sagebrush obligates, we found that sagebrush obligates actually, they like sagebrush. And so we found a threshold very similar to grouse, and we look at about a 40% landscape cover. And I'm not talking about individual plant cover, but actually plant communities that encompass that landscape. We double our abundance of those individual passerines. So same with sage grouse, about that 40% threshold is where we see those birds wanting to occupy. So we knew at that base level we're seeing commonality in those types of habitats those birds were keying off of. So the result of the modeling process was then developing a continuous surface and predicting abundance across that same landscape. And the map you see here is for brewer's sparrow. Looking across that landscape, we can see a similar abundance if you can picture that image in your mind of where sage grouse are. And this is that map looking at lek distribution. You almost don't need statistics to see that if you overlay those 2 maps, you're seeing a pretty tight alignment between the distribution of brewer sparrow and sage grouse. So what we wanted to do here now was actually compare lek distribution as a surrogate for grouse abundance to that continuous surface of brewer sparrow abundance and sagebrush sparrow and sage thrasher across that entire range of grouse. And so to do that, we use what we call a point pattern analysis. So we randomized the distribution of leks. We accounted for the autocorrelation and clustering that we typically see in lek distributions. We ran it through a simulation and compared the outcome results to that to the actual correlations back to birds using their actual locations, and found that indeed we proved that long-standing notion that grouse in fact are very predictive of songbird distribution and abundance. So they're in the same place at the same time, but we said, wait a minute, conservation for sage grouse often is focused in those areas that have very high abundance. So you saw the priority areas for conservation we typically focus our resources in. We took these high density leks, those leks that had the most birds, and ran the same modeling effect to determine if those high density population centers of songbirds and grouse aligned once again. What we found is that these high density leks, actually the songbird abundance increased 13 to nearly 20%. So those high density places of songbirds and grouse, in fact, do align. So we can think about our strategy for conservation in grouse. We're targeting those high density populations, or also targeting those high density populations of songbirds. So we had a win-win for both species. One step further, now we know that both populations and high densities correlate. Now we want to relate it back to those conservation strategies. So what we did, we took a place-based practice of conifer removal, and we said, given our known conifer removal sites across the West, these are actually SGI-driven cuts on private lands across the West. How do those correlate to different species? And so we looked at brewer's sparrow, and brewer's sparrow correlated really well. Because of the place-based conservation practice in those landscapes, brewer's sparrows exist. 85% of the cuts across the West actually occur in high to moderate abundance brewer sparrow populations. But we don't want to just assume there's benefits with grouse and songbirds, so we take it to the next level. And Holmes et al., who is part of the special edition REM, looked at those cuts in Oregon and said, when we apply those cuts, we actually see an increase in nest density of brewer sparrow post-treatments. And so just like grouse, those birds are responding quickly, moving into those cuts. And so we're seeing, again, that benefit at the site level for these guys. But we said, well, in all of our conservation strategies we have right now, we can examine it at site-based scale. So we looked at these broader landscape-driven effects. And so here, we look at sagebrush sparrow using the Wyoming core area strategy. So in Wyoming, they're saying there's places we're going to really regulate how we move energy development into, so we can really ensure we have these places set aside for sage grouse. And we'll develop these other areas outside these sage grouse core areas in a different way. But inside these areas, we want to see that low fragmentation benefit that grouse respond to. If we take that same footprint, knowing that these birds also respond to the same pressures of top-down fragmentation threats, we encompass over half of those high-density populations that exist inside the Wyoming Basin using the core area strategy for sage grouse. So again, we're seeing a culmination of those broader landscape-level strategies targeting grouse, also with a high potential for benefiting these other sagebrush obligate songbirds. We can move over to the Great Basin now and look at fiat. So where we're trying to mitigate invasive annual grasses, fire, and conifer invasion, we're seeing another benefit. In this case, we're using the example of sage thrasher, where those sage thrashers are largely encompassed by what will be preserved and targeted for sage grouse through fiat through this planting strategy. So again, that big alignment, big landscapes, also down to the conifer site base, we're seeing a big collusion of these conservation strategies that cross sage grouse and songbirds. I didn't get really deep into the analysis. Folks want to reach out and really learn more about what we've done in the study, you can reach back to the Science to Solutions edition with SGI. Great thing to hand out to folks on the ground to explain what we're doing in more layman's terms. But more importantly, there's beyond this, we're seeing next steps in how we're going to roll out additional songbird, sage grouse conservation treatments. And the first slide, or the first graphic you see here, it says old on the top. The original research we did, remember, used that entire length of that transect in BBS. So we had a number of birds throughout that whole transect that were counted. We took the average and we buffered that entire route, and then we culminated all those individual habitat metrics along that entire route. Well, that gave us some pretty good data, but we didn't really link the distribution of those birds down to a really small specific site on the ground. What we're limited by was actually knowing where those stops were across those landscapes, those places that individual observers stopped, got out of their car, and counted those birds. Remember, there's 50 of them. With a grant from the Fish and Wildlife Service and cooperation from partners, we went in and actually painstakingly identified those 50 stop locations for all BBS routes across the West. So now when we count birds and relate it back to a stop, we know exactly where that bird was counted, and we can relate those habitat metrics for that location back to that bird's ID. So it increases our resolution of the data we can move forward with in identifying how these birds utilize those landscapes in these broader scales. So what does that mean for us, and where are we going with this? So recently received a grant from WAFA to identify and look at how some of these broader scale impacts of conifer removal and other things are affecting not just sage-grouse obligates, but other passerines across the West. And you've heard repeatedly today about we're cutting lots of conifer, we're moving across broad landscape scales and whacking all the trees down. Well, there's increasing anxiety over those effects on some of these woodland and forested birds that occupy the Great Basin. And so this table, using BBS data and looking at declines in either decreasing or increasing population, shows we can see the sagebrush obligate birds all in that kind of declining mode, with the exception of sagebrush sparrow, which is neutral. If you look at those forested birds of concern, the BBS data actually tells us they're still all increasing to neutral. But there's one bird up here that's declining, and that's pinon jays. And so with this new information, what we're doing is actually using BBS data with our increased 50 stop now capability, and then linking those habitat attributes that are specific to pinon jays back into our models. Now, we have additional models we've actually run, we didn't talk about today, that talk about optimization tools for conifer removal that link sage-grouse nesting and breeding sites to mesic sites and connectivity across landscapes. And this is an example of the model you can see here on the right. Those red areas are areas we'd go in and remove conifer to optimize those benefits to grouse. With the new data now and incorporation of the pinon jay, we can actually pull a penalization lever in that model to actually go into these same sites and avoid those areas that would be beneficial for pinon jays, so we can actually move forward again with benefits to grouse and songbirds, but ensure that we're leaving those sites that are most beneficial to pinon jay to keep moving across those landscapes and removing that conifer without having negative impacts on those birds as well. So again, a way we can utilize the data to move forward and keep all birds happy, not just a single species. I'm going to wrap it up with that, with questions folks have on the work we're doing. Christian.
So Patrick, on the moving forward, are you looking at that strictly in an occupancy framework, or is it more an abundance framework based on those individual stocks?
Abundance. Yeah. Dave. You're asking the wrong guy. The general thought, I guess, is declines in pinon pine across the West. Rick, maybe you can allude to some of that. Oh, repeat. Oh, sorry. The question Dave asked was why the general decline in pinon jays across the West. So, Rick, I can defer to you and pinon pine.
One possibility is that we've seen a lot of this infill, increased densities of pinon pine, and what we don't have good data on, but what could be happening is we get an increased competition in density of trees. Your pine apple crops are probably going to decline.
Same number of trees, but just a poor crop.
So you're getting more close stand trees rather than what we think is stands are more open. A lot of these old stands are more open. And so it might have a big effect on the pine crop. There's no doubt. There was one really great study on pinion jays that they really know where, if there's an area that has very light pinion crop, they will not go there. They'll find where the big pine crops are in the winter time. They'll kind of move around.
So Rick's initial question for those in the audience out in webinar land was infill and pinon stands actually reducing pinon crop, and the birds responding to that lesser crop, and yeah, possibly. Was there another hand I saw back there somewhere else? Hannah wanted me to say there's copies of that Science and Solutions I showed up here on the songbird work out on the table in front of the door. Okay. Great. Thanks, guys.